Hello everybody, welcome back to Fundamentals of Physical Geography. We're in week 8, so this is step 8, and steps 7 and 8 together have been looking at systems and cycles in physical geography. In step 7 we looked at the idea of approaching physical geography from a systems approach, and we used landscapes as a first example of how we can do that, identifying components, connections, fluxes, stores and so on, the whole paraphernalia of the systems approach, and looking at that as a way of simplifying our view of the complex world around us. This week in step 8 I simply want to encourage you to look at some more examples of that way of looking at the world, and in doing so to get your heads around a couple of more really important ideas in physical geography. The idea of ecosystems and biogeography, and the idea of biogeochemical cycles, as well as the idea that you've already encountered previously in the module of the hydrological cycle, which is a nice convenient illustration, a nice convenient example of how systems work in physical geography and how they're connected to lots of different things. The hydrological cycle, for example, we tend to think of it as being, initially we tend to think of it as being all about moving water around the planet, but of course it's also about moving energy around the planet. And that connection of material and energy and distributions and movement, well, that's right at the heart of physical geography. We've said all along that physical geography is all about the impact of energy on materials driving processes. We've said it's all about geographical variability, differences from one place to another, and how those variabilities drive processes such as the movement of energy from the equator towards the poles, which in turn drives atmospheric circulation, ocean circulation, weather systems and so on. So the world is a big complicated set of interconnections and interconnected processes, energy sources and movements of material and energy. How do we visualize that? And that's one thing that systems and the idea of cycles in the natural environment is really good for us as physical geographers. It helps us to envisage those complex realities in a more understandable, approachable kind of a way. So our key point this week is that reality is complex and interconnected, and I want you to start thinking about how we can view that in a more usable kind of a way through the use of the systems approach and looking at biogeography, ecosystems, biogeochemical cycles and the hydrological cycle as illustrations of that. So what we've done this week is provide you with some basic readings from the core text that will introduce you to the essentials on all of those topics of biogeography, ecosystems, etc. The basic reading is there ready for you, and it's easy for you to access online through the module reading list through the library web pages. So the basic information is really accessible for you. On top of that, I'm going to provide some slightly more detailed information and some signposting and some illustration, if you like, of what these points are that we're trying to make by talking about the hydrological cycle. I'll do that in a separate video following on from this one, but I'll give you a little bit of an illustration of how you can think about these topics using the hydrological cycle as my example. We've then on the KLE given you some very basic starter background information about what biogeography and ecosystems are, what biogeochemical cycles are, and some basic reading to get you started on that. But then we're going to leave it to you to pick a case study, if you like, from that. You don't necessarily need to get to grips with every detail of every biogeochemical cycle or every aspect of ecosystems, but have a look at the basics and then pick a case study for yourself. Maybe you're interested in the carbon cycle, for example. So have a closer look at the carbon cycle, say, and we'll give you some links or some access points into the more detailed literature on that to get you started. But it's very easy for you to just search through something like Google Scholar or Web of Science. It's very easy for you to find some accessible resources on that that will give you some more detail on top of what we're covering in our sessions. So we'll give you the basic starting points. We'll cover the essentials of the hydrological cycle as a case study or an illustration, and then it's up to you to do the basic reading and find one case study of your own, such as the carbon cycle, to go into in a little bit more detail. So we'll talk about the hydrological cycle. I just want to remind you what I said last time in step 7 about systems, and we've talked about the hydrological cycle earlier in the module. But you're familiar with the idea that we can simplify the ocean in all its magnificent complexity. We can simplify it to a box. And we can say, in terms of a particular interest that we might have in the ocean, let's say how water moves around, we can say, well, that box has inputs, for example, from precipitation, and it has outputs, for example, evaporation. And we can say, well, where are those inputs and outputs coming from and going to? Well, we can identify the atmosphere. And now we have a connected system with the atmosphere and the oceans and fluxes of material between the atmosphere and the oceans through precipitation, and from the oceans to the atmosphere by evaporation. We can then also have outputs from the atmosphere to the terrestrial environment, the Earth's surface, precipitation. We can then have runoff or flow from the Earth's surface back to the oceans. We can also have flow from the terrestrial environment into the ground. You get the idea, you see what's happening here. I'm simplifying a really complex reality into basically boxes and arrows. So that's what we talked about in step 7. I now want you to apply that kind of thinking to a variety of case studies, beginning with the hydrological cycle, but then picking one of your own, and that's what step 8 is really all about. What we'll have done by the end of step 8 is basically put lots of chunks of physical geography into boxes. So we talked right at the beginning of the module about energy impacting the Earth's surface, driving processes to create features and the distributions of those features. Essentially that's giving us geography. Well, we stuck that in a box. We're now saying, well, let's look at how all these interactions are going on, how those connections work. Stick that in a box. And one thing that you'll have identified by this stage is that there's a broad driving environment or a set of environmental controls, such as climate, for example, that are really important in characterizing some of these key relationships. So this energy up here, for example, the way that it's impacting the Earth's surface, well, that's very much connected to environmental factors such as climate. So having got all of this stuff vaguely under control up to this point, we've kind of thrown ourselves open to a big question. The media, geography in general, the planet as a whole is really interested at the moment in environmental change. Climate is changing. We're changing it on top of the natural changes that occur anyway. So if everything is controlled by or driven by or relates back to the environment, that's great. But if the environment is changing, what's environmental change going to do to our growing understanding of how everything works in physical geography? Well, that's what we're moving onto in the remainder of this module. And next week we're going to talk about environmental change. And then we're going to look at, well, how environmental change then is affecting everything else in physical geography. So that's where we are. We've worked our way through from some of the basic building blocks of what physical geography is all about. We've looked at some examples like geomorphology. We've begun to understand the world in terms of these systems and the driving forces and the materials and the energy fluxes and the distributions and the patterns that make up physical geography. We're going to draw that to a close in this section before then moving on to think about environmental change in the next step of the module.